Hello and welcome to this live Talos event, and also hello to those of us to those of you watching us on demand. Now, this is the third in our series of videos discussing the findings of our year in review report, and today we are chatting about the threat landscape. Now, the security community faced an expanding set of adversaries and malware in 2022. So we're going to be talking about some of the major trends and also what those trends might tell us about future attacks that defenders might have to deal with in 2023 and beyond. Now, the Year in Review report is available now. You can download it at blog.talosintelligence.com/year-in-review. You'll also find the threat landscape section in its own special summary PDF on that same webpage. So if you haven't read it, the report contains the investigations of many of our wonderful folks across Talos. We've got our reverse engineers, detection specialists, data scientists, linguists, managed hunt providers, incident responders, and threat intelligence analysts. They all contributed to this wonderful report. So if you missed our discussions on our threat hunting work in Ukraine, and also our investigations on advanced persistent threat actors, both of those videos are available on demand from the same URL as the report. So 2022's threat landscape. What happened? How did threat actors evolve their attacks? And how can we as defenders use that information in 2023? Thankfully, I have the right people here to help answer those questions. So firstly, we have Caitlin Huey, who is a research engineer for the Talos strategy analysis team. We also have Tucker Favreau, one of Talos's threat hunters. Hopefully, at some point, we will have Nick Biasini, head of outreach for Talos, just to add a little bit of jeopardy. His power went out about 15 minutes ago, so he is sprinting to the nearest Talos office, which is quite the commitment. So hopefully he will join us in a little bit. If you're interested to know about the data for this report, we use telemetry sets gathered across Talos, including behavioral indicators from secure malware analytics, snort and ClamAV alerts, as well as behavioral protections from Cisco Secure Endpoint, and case studies from Cisco Talos incident response engagements. Last thing from me before I start my questions, we will be taking your questions live, so do submit those in the comments section on LinkedIn or by replying to us on Twitter. So as soon as those questions pop into your head, please do ask them and we will get to those as soon as possible. So my first question is for Caitlin. Welcome, Caitlin. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, in the report, you talk about how some trends emerged from Talos incident response engagement, which set the tone for the threat landscape in 2022. So I was wondering if you can talk about some of the significant trends and also the effect that they had on the threat landscape.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Hazel. It's nice to be here. So yeah, like you said, this report covers a vast amount of data. This section in particular looks at the threat landscape as a whole, and the threats in an expanding set of adversaries, malware, tactics, techniques, and behaviors that enterprise environments as well as the security community consistently observed in 2022. The major trends are based on data from telemetry sets and subject matter experts across Talos. For example, Talos incident response and the engagements Talos IR responded to definitely set the tone for some of these trends. We can continue to see them play out throughout the rest of the year, like you said. So within this section, one of the trends we focused on was a reliance on offensive security frameworks like Cobalt Strike, Brute Ratel, that are being used to support activity for a number of adversaries and threats. These frameworks are also referred to as dual-use tools because they are legitimately used, and so the activity can blend in with expected red teaming or normal system administration activity. In terms of the effect that they had for the rest of the year, 2022 showed us that threat actors are likely to continue turning to newer or less commonly known frameworks that may be less familiar to security teams. The TTPs observed in operations leveraging these dual-use tools also can vary greatly. So the range of actions that these tools can perform is also why we think they're increasingly common and incorporated by so many adversaries. The second major trend that we wanted to highlight and highlighted in this section of the report was the usage of the living off the land binaries, or also referred to as LOL bins, that we consistently observed affecting enterprise environments. The concept and adversaries' use of LOL bins are not new, but given that LOL bins are native and come pre-installed on operating systems, it makes it more difficult for defenders and researchers to detect against and identify the attackers behind the activity. LOL bins can also present additional challenges to defenders, as organizations often use these tools as part of legitimate sysadmin functions. So we expect them to remain popular among a wide variety of threat actors, as they are seen as an efficient means of staying undetected within an organization. The third and final major trend that we highlighted is the use of USB drives to deliver malware. We keep saying this phrase, "what was old is new again," to describe this subset of activity. So throughout 2022, we observed several malware families delivered in this way, targeting Windows systems and then spreading through removable drives. Adversaries have been leveraging USB drives for years, but the various activities we observed incorporating USBs just highlights that the threat has not gone away, and that threat actors will continually look to rely on techniques that remain successful, especially against older legacy enterprise systems.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that overview, Caitlin. So we're going to be diving into all of those trends that Caitlin just mentioned there throughout this broadcast. Nick is going to talk a little bit about Cobalt Strike and the effect that they had on the threat landscape in 2022. But I wonder if you could stay on frameworks just for a second with you, Caitlin. You mentioned Silver and Brute Ratel. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how these have been used to carry out attacks and what we've seen from a Talos incident response perspective.
Definitely. Yeah, I can speak to one notable example using the open source red teaming tool Sliver or Sliver. So early on in 2022, we began seeing activity in endpoint telemetry for the Sliver implant. These sightings also coincided with a Talos IR engagement, where Sliver was used to support a Conti ransomware attack, exploiting the Log4j vulnerabilities for initial access on an unpatched vulnerable VMware Horizon server. Talos IR then subsequently observed PowerShell commands attempting to download and then silently execute a malicious Windows installer file, which initiated the installation of a Terra agent, another legitimate remote management tool that provides means for ransomware affiliates to achieve persistence, using a number of other additional remote access tools like AnyDesk or Splashtop. So we observed the adversary using PowerShell to download and execute payloads masquerading as a VMware executable, which was identified to be a Sliver implant. At the time, Sliver's presence in an engagement involving the Conti ransomware was pretty notable, as there was little to no publicly reported instances of Conti leveraging the implant in their operations. Sliver has since been publicly reported as a Cobalt Strike alternative. For example, around the middle of the year, Talos identified another ransomware affiliate distributing the Avos ransomware, using both Cobalt Strike and Sliver in post-exploitation activities, just showing how swiftly it was adopted into a variety of actors' toolkits.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. So we cover dual-use tools a lot in this specific section of the report. So dual-use meaning they can be used for legitimate reasons, but also illegitimate. And I was wondering, Tucker, could you talk about how defenders can best detect these dual-use tools within their networks?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting with the frameworks that we've already mentioned, right, when you have Cobalt Strike or Brute Ratel or Sliver, is as they gain popularity, of course, more and more researchers begin researching them and writing blogs on how to detect those activities and the related techniques, right? So for those ones, it's a little bit easier. If you have, only a handful of people that can focus on it, you can kind of look up a few blogs, read up on it really quickly, and get some detections. Not to mention that the big providers, like for our secure endpoint, we very quickly push out new rules and alerts and detections automatically for you because they're just so commonplace, right? So those ones are a little bit easier. If you're not familiar with the tool, you can kind of just look it up real quick and read through a few things. And what we have to remember is that while the tools themselves are very, very popular, for the most part, they're not doing anything that's completely out of the ordinary. They're using like tried and true techniques that have been working for a while, or they might be new techniques, but they're very quickly realized from a patching cycle, right? They get revealed in a patch. So for those ones, it's honestly not that difficult to kind of detect those ones. But the other dual use tools that are out there, like Caitlin kind of mentioned, there are other tools like AnyDesk and the Terra and these other tools that there is no detection for them because they are in fact legitimate tools that aren't even in the cybersecurity space, right? Those ones are a bit more difficult to actually hone in on and detect. And so it's an often repeated phrase, and I know it's much easier said than done, but knowing your network really is going to be the way that you can detect some of those other tools. So as Talos, we operate at a very strategic level. We take in a lot of data. Sometimes it may be difficult for us to look at a data set and be like, oh, there's AnyDesk. Is that legitimate within that network? But if you are actually managing your own network, you can just look and say, hey, we don't authorize AnyDesk on our network. It shouldn't be anywhere. We need to investigate why it's all of a sudden on this host, right? So understanding your own network, understanding what's normal for your systems, that's really the key for detecting a lot of these dual use systems or dual use tools and understanding what they're doing on your networks.
Absolutely. That's great advice. Thank you, Tucker. I'm going to stay with you for a little bit. Caitlin mentioned lol bins in the major trends that we saw last year. I was wondering, how have you, as a threat hunter, how have you seen lol bins utilized for attacks in 2022?
Of course. So obviously, lol bins is a very general category now. There's a lot of things that get thrown in there. We could probably spend an entire stream on PowerShell alone and maybe set a record for the longest stream ever, right? Because we just never run out of things to talk about with PowerShell. So if we kind of skip over PowerShell a little bit, adversaries really have branched out quite a bit. And what's interesting is originally, when lol bins kind of first came around as like a major avenue for getting objectives on any host, it was very simple. You just did one lol bin, you achieved what you wanted, and then that was it. Now, because detections are coming out, because people have better behavioral detections for things that are abnormal, you sometimes see lol bins that are being chained together, or they're part of a much larger attack, and they're only accomplishing one small thing in scope of a much larger attack. And even now, in addition to the chaining of those things, we're also seeing some of them being obfuscated quite heavily, right? And in many cases, it almost becomes impossible on initial run to detect that it's a lol bin, but you can detect on the obfuscation that's being, used to hide those things that are happening. So as lol bins have evolved and the detections have evolved, the arms race continues. There's always going to be, every time a new detection comes out, there's going to be a new obfuscation, some other way to get around it. I will say that from what we see on a regular basis, this past year, MSI exec and Rundle 32, those have been two very heavy hitters that we constantly see are being abused. So obviously, PowerShell command prompt are always going to be watched. But if you really have to hone in and look at a few other things, MSI exec and Rundle 32, those are some big ones. And again, lol bins are hard to detect. There's a reason we can't push out, alerts for everything, because the false positive rate would be so high that people would spend 99% of their time researching something that ends up in a dead end, right? So again, knowing your network and understanding what is normal for your network is yet again, I hate to be the broken record, but that's the key to understanding, and catching lol bins on your own networks.
Yep, absolutely. How do you spot unusual behavior if you don't know the barrier for normal? I think that's great advice. I believe we've been able, Nick has been able to join us, having sprinted from his home to the nearest Talos office. Thank you so much. That is going above and beyond. But to be honest, knowing the Talos culture, that is par for the course. So welcome, Nick. So anyone who doesn't know Nick is our head of outreach for Cisco Talos. So Nick, we have been covering some of the frameworks, and Tucker's just been covering lol bins there, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Cobalt Strike. Mm-hmm. We've been dealing with Cobalt Strike for many years, but how did it affect the threat landscape in 2022?
So the easiest way I can describe it is it's everywhere. Whether you're talking about nation states, script kiddies, and everyone in between, Cobalt Strike beacons are just incredibly common payloads. And that creates a lot of challenges for defenders, right? You're seeing, whether it's a loader, whether it's a spam campaign, whether it's an info stealer, anything that has the ability to load additional malware, what we see is Cobalt Strike time and time again. And most of the time it's using the copy that's been pirated. So it makes it very difficult to do anything other than just realize it's being used, extract the configs, and try and figure out what additional payloads or other connections you need to be concerned about. And that's really what defenders are kind of tasked with today, if they get alerts for Cobalt Strike beacons being blocked or being detected on the network, you almost have to go down, extract that config, and figure out what exactly they were trying to do with it. Because a Cobalt Strike beacon alone could literally be anything from someone going to drop a crypto miner onto your system to a nation state knocking on your door and a very, very big breach that you need to be concerned with. We literally see every adversary using it at some point in their infection chain or something similar to Cobalt Strike.
Yeah, absolutely. And Cobalt Strike, it definitely opened the door for adversarial use of these tools. I don't know if inspired is the right word, but we definitely saw this landscape grow considerably last year. So I was wondering, Caitlin mentioned like Silver and Brute Ratel as additional frameworks. Could you talk a bit more about these frameworks and how they're actually being used by adversaries today?
Yeah, it's very similar to what we see with Cobalt Strike because there's been so much attention on Cobalt Strike and detections around it. One of the things we are seeing is more groups are moving to some of the alternatives. You mentioned a couple there, Brute Ratel and Sliver. One thing I would say for defenders is some of these frameworks are open source, like Sliver. Go download them, use them, understand how they operate. That's a huge asset for a defender to be able to understand these offensive tools. And this is true for any of the frameworks that they're using that are publicly available. Go download them, play around with them, understand how they operate, look at the artifacts that they leave on systems, and start to understand how you can build protections to help protect yourself and help prevent these types of attacks from occurring. Because we really do see both Brute Ratel and Sliver becoming more and more popular as detections get better and better around Cobalt Strike.
Excellent. And just a reminder for our audience to keep sending your questions in to us through the comments on LinkedIn or by replying to this stream on Twitter, and we will we'll look at them and we'll get to them very, very shortly. Nick, I want to stay with you just for one more question. We also saw two separate offensive networks developed by threat actors for their own purposes. And we go into detail about these two in the report. So Manjusaka and Alchemist. I was wondering, could you provide an overview of both of these and why the security community needs to be aware of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So Manjusaka and the Alchemist and Insect, which is the implant associated with Alchemist, were a couple of discoveries that came out of my team. We found, in one case, we found Manjusaka being actively used in the wild. And another time, we haven't seen Alchemist activity in the wild, but we're fairly certain that it's occurring. We just haven't seen it yet. These are yet another layer of these types of offensive frameworks. These two ones in particular are written in Chinese, but they do allow for a huge amount of attack surface and configuration to happen. And largely what they represent is a one-stop shop. So in the case of Alchemist, you have a single executable that you can run on a system that provides you the ability to create implants, develop the scripts to send those implants, and handle command and control infrastructure. This lowers the barrier for this type of activity significantly. And what it really does is it allows people who can read Chinese to use a web GUI to be able to go through these processes, to be able to create these type of attack frameworks. And more generally, what it shows you is that adversaries notice that these types of frameworks are incredibly popular. And the more of them that are out there, the more opportunity that they have to use them, the more opportunity that attribution is clouded, right? These tools are available freely on GitHub. It's very, very hard to say, oh, well, this particular tool is used by this group when anyone can download it off the internet, build it, and use it. It's one of the big reasons why we continue to see this collapse. It makes attribution incredibly hard, and that's the point.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Nick, when I said that was your last question, I lied. You should be used to this from me now as host. I do have one more. I just wanted to get your take because we spoke to Tucker talked about Lolbins and what he's been seeing as a threat hunter. I was wondering whether we could get your take on your advice to the security defenders who are listening. What is the best way to go about spotting the malicious use of Lolbins?
Well, I know that Tucker spent a good amount of time talking about the levels of obfuscation and all the challenges that are present for defenders. One of the things that I always say to defenders, and it's not a super sexy thing, but audit your network. Permission creep is a serious problem. You really need to restrict who can actually run these low bins. That will help you immensely. There's no reason that every user on your network should be able to run PowerShell. It's just not something that users need to do. That is one of the most important thing organizations can do. Go back and edit your permissions, edit your user groups. Make sure that people who do not need access to these tools do not. And most importantly, make sure you have detection in place for when one of them tries to run it, because an adversary doesn't know that they can't run PowerShell. So the first time they're on a box, they're going to attempt to use it, and it gives you an opportunity to detect that denied access. So that type of stuff is incredibly important, not so much on the technology side, but in the auditing and making sure that your environment is secure as it can be.
Absolutely. Great advice. Tucker, I wanted to talk to you about something that Caitlin mentioned at the start about a trend that we saw in 2022 that we may not have expected to, and that is the resurgence of the old but very effective tactic, which is spreading malware by USB sticks. Would you be able to talk to us about why this tactic is back?
Yeah, absolutely. Unexpected is a good word for that. So what's interesting is I feel like most people in the cybersecurity space have probably heard of a few of these attacks over the last year because many of them have become really prolific. So the example here would be Raspberry Robin, for instance. Back in January of last year, February of last year, we started noticing some very, very unusual MSI exec activity reaching out to domains that were, you could look at the domain and you knew it was bad, right? There was no way it was a legitimate domain. And as we kind of looked at these attacks and we would backtrace them and try to figure out what the actual initial access method was, we started seeing USB events, which, you know, not, like you said, not something we expected to see on some of the systems, especially given how widespread this activity was. I mean, once we started catching the activity, we saw it basically globally very, very quickly. And so it's interesting that as time goes on, sometimes the adversaries are aware that they can't just have one method to gain access all the time, right? Especially when folks like Microsoft start disabling macros in emails and things start getting a little bit more difficult. Phishing obviously still remains like the key way of getting into networks right now. It's still a major problem. But as major organizations start restricting the ability for every attack to work and things get to ISO files and things change a little bit, old methods are now surely going to resurge as people kind of forget about them. And even if you don't necessarily forget about them, it's one of those things where, you know, after a long time, you don't think it's a problem anymore. You might assume that some security is built in now. And that's where USBs come into play. No matter what happens, human curiosity is a very dangerous thing sometimes. Sometimes it's very exciting, sometimes it's very dangerous. And when somebody finds a USB on the ground, there's still a lot of people in the world who are going to say, well, I wonder what this is. And they're going to plug it into a computer and try to see what's on it, right? You know, we can talk about that, you know, day and night, whether or not that's a good thing. Probably not. But because of things like that, it's effective. That's what it comes down to. Adversaries will use whatever works, no matter how simple or dumb it may seem or how complex it may seem. If it works, they're going to use it. And as evidenced by how prolific Raspberry Robin has been, it works really well, apparently. And so it's kind of become this problem where USBs are very convenient for just kind of transferring some information around, but because of their convenience, they're an easy target, and people are going to use them. So that's why it came back.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you say, like, you know, simple, but simple is often best when it comes to cyber attacks. They take the path of least resistance, and USB sticks is one of them. All right, so I do have one more question before I turn it over to our audience. So please do get those questions in, type those questions in the comments, or reply to this post on Twitter. So my last question is for all three of you. Caitlin, I'm going to come to you first. How do the threat landscape trends that we've talked about of last year, how do they help us inform us about what defenders may have to deal with during 2023?
Yeah, so the trends that we saw throughout 2022 just highlight the techniques leveraging low bins or the techniques leveraging dual-use tools just won't be going away for many of the reasons Tucker and Nick mentioned. They help blur attribution. So many other groups and actors are using them. We continue to see new dual-use tools emerge or cracked versions becoming available, just increasing the pool of threat actors using them. For example, in calendar year Q4 2022, for example, a major trend we saw coming out of Talos IR engagements was the use of the Synchro remote management and monitoring tool as an increasingly common tool being used. This tool was something we'd seen previously in engagements and elsewhere, but its increased use sort of indicates it's becoming popular and leveraged in addition to other commonly seen dual-use tools.
Excellent. Thanks, Caitlin. Nick, how about yourself? What do the trends tell us about this year?
So there's a lot of interesting things to take from that. One of the things that I see with the continued, with macros being disabled and various other things going into play, the value of things like phishing attacks is going to continue to go up, realizing that things like MFA fatigue are going to become increasingly bigger problems as time goes on. Make sure that you have your MFA enabled to help reduce the value of that. As Tucker pointed out, what's old is new again. So what we're seeing is lots and lots of USB drive usage. Again, time to dust off some of that decade-plus old security training that you used to have in most security environments to say, please don't plug in the USB drive that you find in your parking lot or wherever that may be. As a reminder, probably a good idea to throw in some social engineering messaging with that as well to say, don't answer phone calls and text messages. Don't call people when they ask you. Unsolicited MFA is a bad thing. Please litter in some social engineering training in there. That's another trend that's starting to emerge more and more. As these systems get harder and harder to exploit, the adversaries are going to move to the weakest link. Right now, we see a lot of phishing. As we continue to have phishing get more and more less value, you're really going to see social engineering start to pick up. It's very easy to manipulate a person, much more so than manipulating a system. That's always something to keep in mind.
Perfect. Sorry, I muted myself there because the famous cat who likes to interfere with all of the live streams is making a right order racket. So, Tucker, I'd like to come to you last but not least for your take on the trends and how they will help us this year.
So, at the risk of having virtual tomatoes thrown at me, I'm going to talk a little bit about AI. All right, so give me a second, and I will get there. So what we've seen, over the last year, really is that arms race of small permutations and attacks to get around defensive measures, just barely, right? Sometimes it takes a lot of effort to make a brand new tool, but changing something just slightly works, right? So when we talk about phishing, for instance, and all the different levels of phishing and how things have evolved over time, what's very unfortunate is that OpenAI is pretty good at developing phishing emails. So a lot of the times as you see people who struggle to write emails or adversaries struggle to write emails, and it's easy to pick out like, hey, that grammar isn't correct, that sentence isn't correct, or something like those obvious signs. AI is one of those things that really is helping develop very, very unfortunately effective phishing emails. And that's not the only space, right? We talk about how there's so many open source tools that are out there. The barrier to entry for cybersecurity has always been very low. There's been the way to get in. It's the reason why there's a lot of folks who make a living off of doing very nefarious things, unfortunately, because it's somewhat easy to get into if you're an intelligent person. Now that comes back with some of these AI tools to some extent. You can take a tool, run it through an AI and try to get a different type of obfuscation out of it. You can just try to make your own tools. And the problem is that even if it's not good enough to work the way you want it to work, it's still dangerous, right? There are all sorts of times when tools don't do what we expect them to do, and it causes more damage than less because it does something that we don't expect it. I don't know if you go way back to the old days of Hack the Box when we're trying to do a box and all of a sudden it crashes because somebody ran a tool they weren't familiar with and bricked a box and they had to reset it for you, right? That's very much going to happen as we go into the future. And as people see attacks that are successful and try to put their own spin on it through an AI tool without having the actual core knowledge they need to make those decisions, right? They'll just run it and call it good. So I feel like that might become a bit of a bigger issue as we go on through times and as these things get refined. But again, I acknowledge if you want to throw a virtual tomato at me, I will accept it. It's okay.
I won't throw a virtual tomato at you, but I might throw a virtual tomato. But, let's call the whole thing off. All right, let's have a look at some of our audience questions. Tucker, I think I'll come to you on this one. I don't know if this is a loaded question. What sort of recommendations would you give organizations who might still use USBs in their environment?
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, USBs are convenient. There is a legitimate purpose in having them in your organization, right? So, we're not trying to shame people who use USBs because they are very, very good to have. If you are going to use them in your organization, there's a lot of Windows events that you can look at that actually kind of audit these things when they're plugged in, when they're installed. And that's your starting point, right? In order to know what's going on, you need to be able to determine the events that tell you a USB has been plugged into a system, and you need to make sure you understand that. In some cases, you might be able to limit to, hey, only certain people or certain groups within the organization are allowed to use USBs. If you limit it to certain systems or certain groups, it's a little bit easier to write the detections and to work on figuring out, hey, was that a legitimate use or not? So those are some of the other things. Even I struggle to say this, but I have seen it done in the past. There are some cases where only a specific brand or type of USB is allowed. And if you do that in an organization, then all you're auditing for is that's the right type is plugged in. And if it's a type that doesn't fit the company policy, you can immediately know, hey, that is an outsider. We need to look at that. It's a little bit more difficult to do that because you're talking about managing specific USBs, but it is possible. So those are kind of the big things to look out for.
Great. Thank you very much, Tucker. Caitlin, I think this is probably a question for you, but maybe Tucker and Nick, you might want to come in this as well. So in the report, you talk about how you use behavioral protections from Cisco Secure Endpoint. Can you talk about these a little bit more and how we can use these ourselves to inform us about trends in activity?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a trend perspective, we found it incredibly valuable to look at the top 25 or so most alerted behavioral protections from Cisco Secure Endpoint. Some of the volume of alerts, though, associated with some of these protections may seem obvious. For example, looking at behavioral protection data, 4 of the 25 most alerted on behavioral protection signatures in 2022 were PowerShell related, just highlighting how pervasive it is and threat actors' just consistent reliance on the malicious potential of PowerShell. Also, it's how it's legitimately used as well. However, if we're seeing a number of threats leveraging USB drives, like Tucker talked about, we see protections associated with the use of removable drives spike in a given time period. These can also help us to corroborate some of the activity we may be seeing. So those are a few things that I can think of. Not sure if Nick or Tucker have more there.
I can chime in a little bit. For me, the biggest thing about behavioral protections is it casts a wide net, right? It's much more threat agnostic than what typical detection is. It's not going to be specific to a malware family or potentially to a threat actor. It's just going to be more of a behavioral based detection, something that indicates something odd is going on here. There obviously is the likelihood that you're going to get increased false positives because they are largely based on things like lol bins, and you may have a system administrator that runs a lot of commands that look awful malicious, but they're not. It's just something that you have to do. It's one of the reasons why detection of this is so important. It does require some manual review, but it is one of the best ways to detect adversaries that are trying to evade detection and slip underneath the radar.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Nick, we've had a question come in that I'm going to throw to you because you've not had enough challenging things to deal with already today. Do you foresee ChatGPT becoming a major threat vector in 2023?
So I don't know if it's necessarily going to become a major threat vector. I agree with some of the things that people are saying. I don't think it's going to create a bunch of really bad adversaries. I think it's going to take people that already have skill and make them a lot more skilled. So basically, people who have a medium level of sophistication are going to have a much easier time moving into a higher level of sophistication by leveraging things like ChatGPT, right? You can ask it questions, understand the problems that are going on, look for weaknesses in systems. There's a lot of things that you can automate. It is not a one-stop shop. It's not, you can't do something like, hey, go compromise a system for me. It doesn't do things like that. But what it does do is it helps give you knowledge that otherwise would take a lot of time and effort to gather. And it allows you to do it really, really quickly. Like what Tucker talked about, using it in emails, but taking it a step further. What about in conversations in social engineering? You can use ChatGPT to put together very, very convincing social engineering campaigns, various other ways to get used to interacting with people. There's definitely issues. There are ways that this can be used, but I think it's going to be more making bad guys worse than creating a whole class of bad guys, if that makes sense.
Interesting. All right, Nick, I'm going to stay with you for this one. We've got a question. I'm looking to set up a red team within my security organization. Do you have any advice on best practice and how to go about building this team?
So red teaming is incredibly important. There's kind of two schools of thought in this. You know, there's some people who think that the best red teams are always those that are internal because they have a deep understanding of the network. There's also people who think the best red teamers come from external sources because they don't have an understanding of the network and they're willing to do things that maybe the internal team is not. I find that the best is usually some sort of hybrid approach, where you have a contractor or a vendor come in and do an external red teaming, and then you also have your own internal groups. The real goal here is helping make your organization stronger. So what's more important than having a red team is making sure your red team is working with your blue team. It doesn't do you any good for people to find all the vulnerabilities in the world if the blue team isn't working to mitigate those vulnerabilities. So that is really what the focus needs to be. Red teaming is very important, but make sure you involve the blue team in this process and make sure that they're on board and willing to help and facilitate that. Who knows? You might find some of your best red teamers on the blue team. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Caitlin, I think I'll come to you on this first, but by all means, Tucker and Nick, feel free to weigh in as well. What would you say is the biggest change in TTPs by attackers from 2021 to 2022?
Yeah, of course. So I think, we kind of walked through and talked about some of the major trends in 2022, and these absolutely are some of these major TTPs here. So, the techniques associated with leveraging low bins or executing dual-use tools contributed to at least two of the major trends that we saw coming out of 2022. USBs, just show us again that older techniques are proving more effective. And we're probably going to continue to see adversaries just leveraging techniques like USBs against those legacy systems or organizations who don't have patches effectively set up.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. All right. Well, I think that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for watching and for sending in those questions. Thank you to Nick, Power Cut Be Damned. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Caitlin and to Tucker as well for sharing your expertise and your great insights. So you can grab a copy of the Talos Year in Review report. It is full of enormously usable data and analysis on not just the threat landscape, but also major security events. There's a full breakdown of our work in Ukraine. We've got APTs, we've got the evolution of ransomware, we've got much more. So get that report now at blog.talosintelligence.com/year-in-review. Whilst you're there, you will find a brand new article that dropped from Nick today on the Talos blog. It's all about state-sponsored attacks in 2023 and beyond. I had a read of that at lunchtime today, and I humbly suggest that you do the same. We'll be back with another live stream at 12 p.m. Eastern on the 7th of February, and we'll be discussing the ransomware and commodity loaders section of the report. If you follow Talos Security on social media, you'll get all of the details for that event. Until then, thank you so much for watching and take care.